My daughter called me one evening and told me not to come to my own lake house that summer because her husband's parents were staying, and there wouldn't be enough space, which didn't make sense because I paid for that house myself after my husband died, and my name is the only one on the deed. But I didn't argue. I just said okay, hung up, and let them believe I would step aside like I always had. Then 3 weeks later, without telling anyone, I sold the house completely, signed every paper myself, and closed the deal right before the 4th of July weekend they had already planned there. And when my daughter called me panicking, saying there were strangers inside and asking what was going on, I told her the truth. If there wasn't room for me in my own house, then there wasn't going to be a house for them. Either the voicemail came in at 6:47 p.m. while I was standing at the stove stirring chicken and dumplings. The same slow, steady way I've done for years. And when Lauren's name lit up, I assumed she was calling about summer plans at the lake house like she always did. But instead, her voice came out careful and already decided, as she said Derek's parents were coming for a few weeks, and the kids wanted to invite friends so it would be crowded, and maybe I should skip this summer because it would be easier. And she said it like it wasn't a discussion, like it had already been agreed to somewhere I wasn't part of, then added a quick, "Love you," and hung up before I could answer. And I stood there a few seconds too long with the burner still on low as the dumplings started sticking at the bottom because I had stopped stirring without noticing. And it wasn't the words that stayed with me, but how simple she made it sound. Like I was the extra piece that didn't fit anymore. Like removing me solved the problem. And I turned off the stove, set the spoon down, and replayed it again in my head because I've spent most of my life as a nurse listening to people say difficult things in careful ways. And I know the difference between something being temporary and something already decided. And that didn't feel temporary. That felt settled. And the part that didn't make sense wasn't the excuse about space, but the fact that the house she was talking about wasn't something that just filled up on its own, because I paid for that place myself after my husband died. Handled every decision from permits to contractors, and my name is the only one on the deed and always has been. And everyone in the family knows that because I've been the one paying the taxes and the upkeep since the day it was finished, which is why I didn't call her back right away or argue or try to correct anything. I just said okay when she called again 2 days later and repeated the same explanation about timing and how Derek had already taken time off and his parents had booked flights and they were trying to keep things simple. And she kept using that word again, easier, like it explained why I didn't belong there this time. And I let her finish without interrupting, because there's a point in conversations where pushing doesn't give you better answers. It just tells people you're willing to accept whatever version they give you, and I wasn't interested in that. So a few days later, I drove out to the lake house without telling anyone, partly to check on a couple of maintenance things I'd been meaning to handle anyway, and partly because I wanted to see for myself what full actually looked like. And when I pulled into the driveway, Derek's truck was already there parked off to the side, which wasn't unusual by itself, but the front porch was different. There were new chairs out there that I hadn't bought, and a stack of empty delivery boxes pushed against the wall like something had recently been set up. And I let myself in with my key, And the house was intact, but not the same. The small writing desk I kept by the window was gone and replaced with a larger one with cables and a monitor, like someone had decided that space had a different purpose now. And the framed photo of Walter that used to sit above the fireplace had been moved to a side shelf. Not removed, just shifted out of the way, and nothing was damaged or missing, but everything felt slightly rearranged in a way that didn't ask permission. And Derek came out from the back room when he heard the door, and for a second he looked surprised before smoothing it over and saying he didn't know I was coming. And I told him I was just checking on the house and asked about the changes. And he said they were trying to make things more functional since they'd been using it more often, especially with his parents planning to stay. And he said it like it had already been decided, like it was an adjustment everyone understood. And when Lauren came in a few minutes later, she hugged me quickly and gave me the same explanation in softer words about temporary changes and making space for everyone and nothing being permanent. And I listened without interrupting and then asked her one question, simple enough that it didn't need explaining. If she had thought to call me before moving things around. And there was a pause just long enough to answer that for me before she said things had been busy and they assumed I wouldn't mind since it was for the family. And that phrase landed the same way it always does, like it replaces ownership with expectation. And I stayed about an hour after that, long enough to look at everything properly and understand what had actually changed. Not just the furniture, but the way decisions were being made. And when I left, I didn't raise my voice or argue or try to fix anything in the moment. I just got back in my car and drove home the same afternoon. And somewhere between the highway and the last stretch of back roads, it stopped feeling like a misunderstanding about one summer and started looking like something more settled than that. Like they had already gotten comfortable treating the house as theirs and were just waiting for me to adjust to it. And by the time I pulled into my driveway, I wasn't thinking about whether I'd go up there that summer anymore. I was thinking about something simpler than that, something I hadn't needed to question until now, which was exactly whose house it actually was, and what that meant if I decided to act like it mattered. By late fall, it was clear the changes at the lake house hadn't been temporary. They had settled into something routine, something assumed, and the shift showed up in smaller ways first. Lauren called less often, and when she did, the conversations felt timed, like check-ins instead of real talks. And most of what I heard about the house came as updates after decisions had already been made. Derek had someone reinforce part of the dock. They replaced 2 appliances. They reorganized one of the guest rooms so it could fit more people. And none of it was unreasonable on its own. But that wasn't the part that mattered. What mattered was that no one asked anymore. They just informed me like I was being kept in the loop about something that no longer required my input. And I didn't challenge it right away, because pushing too early only teaches people how much they can ignore before you react. So I listened and took note instead. And in November, a few days after Thanksgiving, Lauren called again, and this time her tone was more careful, like she was introducing something she already expected resistance to. And she said they had been thinking since they were using the lake house so often it might make sense to organize things differently. Maybe eventually put the house under both our names to simplify taxes and upkeep. And she said it slowly, like she was trying to make it sound practical instead of what it actually was. which was a shift in ownership dressed up as convenience. And I let her finish before answering because how you respond the first time sets the boundary for everything after. And I told her no, not harshly, not emotionally, just clearly enough that it didn't leave room to reinterpret. I said it was already simple. The house was in my name, and I handled the taxes and upkeep. And there was no reason to change that. And she didn't argue, but the silence that followed wasn't neutral. It was the kind that settles into distance. And after that, the tone between us changed in a way that didn't need to be pointed out. Conversations got shorter. Details became selective. And 2 weeks later, that shift showed up in a more direct way when I received a letter in the mail from a local attorney I didn't recognize. And it wasn't aggressive, but it was formal enough to make its point. Language about voluntary transfer and shared family assets and long-term management. And at the bottom, there was a clean line for my signature, like all it needed was my agreement to turn something assumed into something legal. And I read it twice without reacting, set it on the table, and understood exactly what it was meant to do. It wasn't about legality because there was no legal standing behind it. It was about pressure, about putting the request in a form that looked official enough to make refusal feel unreasonable. And that same evening, I called my attorney. The same one who handled Walter's estate years ago, and sent her a copy. And she confirmed what I already knew, that I wasn't obligated to sign anything, that there was no claim to the property without my consent. And as long as I hadn't transferred or co-signed anything, the house remained entirely mine. And that was all I needed because it removed any uncertainty about where things stood. So I filed the letter away without responding and didn't bring it up with Lauren because there was no value in arguing over something that didn't change the reality of ownership. And in early spring, I drove back out to the lake house again, this time letting Lauren know in advance. And she said they wouldn't be there that weekend, which suited me. And when I arrived, the changes were more settled than before, not dramatic but consistent. The larger desk was still in place. The kitchen had items I didn't recognize, and there were personal belongings that clearly belonged to Derek's parents, things that don't get brought in for temporary stays. And I walked through each room slowly, not looking for damage, but taking inventory of how the space was being used. And everything was intact structurally, but the way it was arranged made one thing clear. This wasn't being treated like a shared family place anymore. It was being lived in like a base, like something stable and expected. And I sat at the kitchen table that afternoon, and for the first time I stopped thinking about what the house used to represent and started asking a simpler question about what it actually was to me now. And the answer was less complicated than I expected. I hadn't spent more than a handful of weekends there in the past year, and every visit felt like checking on something instead of enjoying it. While at the same time, Lauren and Derek were building plans around it as if it were permanently available to them. And that gap wasn't going to fix itself because it wasn't about miscommunication anymore. It was about assumption. And before I left, I took photos of the entire property inside and out, not because I expected a problem, but because documenting the present makes decisions cleaner later. And on the drive home, I called my attorney again, and this time I didn't ask general questions. I asked direct ones about selling, about access, about what obligations I had to people using the property. and she walked me through it step by step. The house was mine to sell. Any use by others was still under my control. And if I chose to move forward, the only requirement was clarity in how I handled access and notice. And that removed the last piece of hesitation, because it turned the situation from something emotional into something procedural. And that night, I opened my laptop and started reviewing listings around Lake Lure, recent sales, pricing trends, how quickly comparable properties were moving. And I wasn't making a decision yet. I was gathering information. But for the first time since Lauren's voicemail, I wasn't looking at the situation as something to fix between us. I was looking at it as a choice I could make on my own. And over the next few days, I spoke with two real estate agents and asked them the same questions about process and timing, and how to handle a property that family used occasionally. And both gave similar answers: that it could be listed without issue as long as I controlled access and set clear expectations. And one of them added something that stayed with me: that pricing it slightly below market would bring serious buyers quickly and reduce back and forth. And I wrote that down and thanked her without committing to anything. And I didn't call Lauren during that time, not because I was avoiding her, but because there was no point starting a conversation before I knew exactly what I was going to do. And by the end of that week, I had everything I needed: legal clarity, market information, and a clear understanding of how the house was being used. And what I didn't have anymore was a reason to keep things the way they were. On June 14, I called Lauren one more time, not to revisit anything that had already been said, but to make sure there was no confusion about what I was about to do. And when she answered, I told her directly that I was moving forward with selling the lake house, and asked if she and Derek wanted to discuss it before I finalized anything. And there was a pause long enough to tell me she hadn't expected that. Then she asked why I would even consider selling it now. And I reminded her of the changes that had been made without involving me, the way the house had been used over the past year, and the fact that I hadn't been able to use it the way I intended for a long time. And she didn't argue with any of that. She just said they had gotten used to relying on it and assumed it would stay that way. And that was the first time she said it plainly, not as a suggestion, but as an expectation. And I told her I understood that, but it didn't change ownership or the decision I was making. And after a second, she shifted to something more practical and asked if they could at least keep their plans for the 4th of July, since Derek's parents had already booked flights and everything was arranged. And I said no, not emotionally, not as a reaction, just as a condition of what comes next, because if I was going to sell the house, it needed to be empty, available for showings, inspections, and whatever else the process required. And I told her I would give them 1 week to remove anything that belonged to them, and after that I would be handing the property over to my agent for listing. And there was another pause after that, shorter this time but heavier, and she said they didn't think it would come to this. And I told her neither did I. And that was the end of the call. No raised voices, no argument, just two people no longer working from the same assumption. And the next morning, I signed the listing agreement with a local agent and set the price slightly below comparable homes in the area, exactly the way we had discussed. And within a few days, there were multiple showing requests, serious ones, the kind that come in quickly when the price is set to move. and I coordinated everything myself, made sure the house was cleared out, scheduled access in tight windows, and documented every step so there wouldn't be confusion later. And Lauren texted once during that week asking if I was really going through with it, and I answered yes. And that was the last message we exchanged before the offers started coming in. And when they did, the process became straightforward. No complications, no delays, just buyers asking practical questions and moving forward. And I accepted a strong offer from a couple planning to retire in the area because they were prepared and ready to close quickly. And the inspection was scheduled, completed, and cleared without issue. And by the time the closing date was set for early July, the outcome wasn't uncertain anymore. It was just a matter of finishing what had already been decided. And on July 2, I sat in the attorney's office and signed the final documents. Every page reviewed, every signature placed where it needed to be. And once the funds were transferred and the paperwork was recorded, the house changed hands completely, legally and permanently. And there was no moment of hesitation in it because everything leading up to that point had already removed the need for it. And later that afternoon, I called Lauren to let her know the sale had gone through. And when she didn't answer, I left a message, kept it simple, told her the house had been sold. The new owners would be taking possession immediately, and anything left behind had already been cleared during the week I had given them. And about an hour later, she called back, and her voice was different this time. Not careful, not measured, just trying to understand how far things had actually gone. And she asked if there had been another option, something that would have let them keep using the house. And I told her there had been earlier, when I first raised concerns and asked to be included in decisions about it. And that window had closed when those decisions kept being made without me. And she was quiet for a few seconds, and then said she wished they had handled things differently. And I told her I did too. And there wasn't anything left to argue about after that because the outcome wasn't something that could be adjusted anymore. And over the next couple of weeks, I handled the practical side of closing accounts, updating records, setting aside the proceeds, and I didn't rush into replacing what I had sold or try to recreate what the house used to represent. I just moved forward with what made sense now. And when Lauren and I spoke again near the end of the month, the conversation was more direct than it had been in a long time. She told me things had been tense on her end, that Derek was frustrated and his parents had been disappointed about their canceled plans. And I listened without taking responsibility for decisions that weren't mine. And I told her going forward I wanted things to stay clear between us. No assumptions. No decisions made on behalf of someone else without asking. And she agreed, not immediately, but enough to make it a starting point. And by then the house itself wasn't the center of anything anymore. It was just something that had been resolved. And what remained was simpler than that. Understanding what I was willing to allow and what I wasn't, and acting on it without waiting for someone else to agree. Because in the end, the house was never the part that needed to be fixed. It was recognizing when I had already been removed from something that was still mine, and deciding not to accept it quietly. The house was never the problem. It was realizing they had already decided it belonged to them, and were just waiting for me to accept it. And the only thing I actually changed was refusing to ask for a place in something that already had my name on it.